like this book a little bit. I've read it more than once. Hello. Today we are going to talk about a book that has been controversial since it was first published in 1847. It is a book I love. I have read it 4 times now, and my dog is named after the author. It is Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. My name is Taryn Tyler. I am an indie writer who writes Gothic fairy tales, and on this channel we talk about Gothic literature, fairy tales, writing life, and really anything bookish that comes to mind. I love all 3 of the Brontë sisters, but Emily Brontë is definitely my favorite. She was known as the wild sister or the strange sister, and is speculated to have been autistic because she struggled so much to really integrate into society. In fact, she got sent home from school because being away from home and away from the wildness of the moors that she loved so much made her physically ill. It was actually her poetry that inspired Charlotte Brontë to have all 3 sisters go and write a novel and get it published. It took a lot of convincing because she didn't really want to be in the public eye, and she eventually only agreed under the condition that all 3 sisters use a pseudonym. I'm gonna read you one of Emily's poems because they are incredible. And it's impossible to really love or enjoy Wuthering Heights to its full potential without understanding, I think, Emily's like love affair with the moors, basically. The night is darkening round me. The wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs weighed with snow, and storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. Clouds beyond clouds above me, wastes beyond wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go. Unfortunately, Emily died a year after Wuthering Heights was published, and within that year, even though the book was really popular, it faced a lot of controversy. Some people really enjoyed it, and others were very, very shocked by it. So much so that in the second edition, Charlotte Brontë wrote an introduction that was part defense and part apology for it having been written, and it includes her saying that it was wrong to invent someone as awful as Heathcliff. So, this dark little book has been controversial since it was first published, and yet people continue to read it. I myself have read it 4 times now, and I continue to be very fascinated with it. And so today we're going to discuss why it's such a fascinating book and whether or not it is, as a lot of the films portray it as, a dark romance. I'm not going to talk about my opinions on the new film adaptation today, but I did see it a couple days ago, so I might do a second video on that. Let me know in the comments if that is something that you would be interested in. And just to let you know, we are going to discuss the story in depth, which means that I'm going to give you the whole summary. So if you want to read this book and experience it for the first time, you can drop out here. That's fine. I'm not offended. But for those of you who have already read it or are okay with a little bit of a preliminary concept of what it is going into it, I'm happy to have you stick around. So, Wuthering Heights opens with a man called Mr. Lockwood. He is a gentleman who is renting a home called Thrushcross Grange from a man named Heathcliff. And he goes to visit Heathcliff at his home, Wuthering Heights. When he arrives, he is surprised because it is such a rustic home and he's renting a very fine mansion. And so he's like, why is the master living in this smaller, less well kept home? And the household he enters consists of a very grumpy servant and a young woman who he finds out is Heathcliff's widowed daughter-in-law, and a man who isn't quite a servant and isn't quite part of the family, who really is pretty uneducated, hasn't been treated as they would call like a gentleman in that time, and kind of is like rough around the edges. A snowstorm sets in while he's there, so he can't go home, so he has to stay the night, and Heathcliff is not hospitable towards him, but he does eventually agree to let him stay, but doesn't really get him a room until the housekeeper takes him to a room that Heathcliff doesn't like anyone to be in, and Mr. Lockwood passes the night there. While he's there, he can't sleep. The storm is keeping him up. He finds some old books with things scrawled in the margin of diary entries from a girl named Catherine. And she has 3 different names: Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, and Catherine Linton. Then he goes to sleep and is woken in the middle of the night by what at first he thinks is the storm, but then he discovers is Catherine's ghost trying to get in. And there's this very creepy scene with her spectral hand going in through the window and trying to pull him out. He screams, and Heathcliff comes running, but rather than be concerned about his guest, Heathcliff is more concerned about the ghost, and he calls out into the night, "Catherine, Catherine, Catherine, come home, come home." But the ghost is gone. So Mr. Lockwood uh, finishes up the rest of the night. He gets out of there as fast as he can. And when he gets home to the place he is renting, he speaks to the housekeeper about the experience. And she used to work at Wuthering Heights, so she has a story to tell him. When Catherine was a little girl, her father went on a trip and came home with a little boy that he found on the streets with nowhere to go, and he decided that he would take him in. He didn't have a name, so they called him Heathcliff. The father dotes on Heathcliff and really seems to favor him even above his own children, Catherine and her older brother Henley. But Catherine, who was closer to the same age as Heathcliff, forms a strong bond with him. She is described as naughty and willful and wild, and runs around on the moors with him all the time, completely untamed and unchecked. She is generally a very spirited and willful child, and her father asks her once why she can't be a good little girl, and she just retorts to him, "Why can't you be a good man?" Even though that double standard isn't really brought up again very much in the book, I think it might be part of why people are kind of drawn to Catherine despite her flaws. Even Charlotte Brontë wrote in her introduction that there's something admirable about her fierceness despite her selfishness and general disregard for rules that comes with that. And I think that maybe disregard for rules might be part of what is enticing about her, because she just like the wild moors she's running around on all the time, and possibly even like Emily, who couldn't fit into society and had to come home to her wild rustic moors and live out in the countryside. She just couldn't be tamed. And that is her greatest flaw, but also possibly her, what's the opposite of a flaw? But also possibly her greatest talent, and part of what draws us to the story. Henley, Catherine's older brother, often beats Heathcliff because of his jealousy, and Heathcliff doesn't complain about it. He stays quiet, but he does say that one day he'll get his revenge. And I think, like Catherine's wild, untamable spirit, Heathcliff's belief from childhood, even though he's been mistreated all his life, that he doesn't deserve it, might be part of what endears us to him. Even though he was born lowly and everyone tells him he doesn't deserve good things, he knows that's not true. And instead of having his spirit broken and accepting that this is his lot in life, he instead schemes to get revenge on the people who have mistreated him. Henley's treatment of him gets worse after his father dies, and he, quite a bit older than Catherine, is now the head of the household. He stops treating Heathcliff like a member of the family, but that doesn't change how Catherine treats him, and they continue to run around wild on the moors. And one day they are avoiding being home because they don't want to get beaten for not following all of Catherine's brother's rules. And they peek into the house at Thrushcross Grange to see how the children there live. And they see Isabella and Edgar Linton fighting over a puppy. They see Catherine and Heathcliff and chase them. Catherine falls and hurts her ankle, and they recognize her as their neighbor and bring her in. But they do not invite Heathcliff in, and quite honestly tell him he's not allowed in because he's dirty. There seems to be an element of racism in the way Heathcliff is treated by everyone around him. It's unclear whether or not he is supposed to have darker skin or if they just tell him that because they're insulting him, but it's still racism because they're using it as an insult either way. And it's just really heartbreaking because at this point in the story, Heathcliff is just a kid, and he's generally a pretty good kid. He's might be unruly and not have, civilized manners or whatnot, but he really just wants to be loved and hang out with his bestie and like run around finding eggs nests on the moors. So like it's really heartbreaking to see everyone just treat him like he doesn't deserve to have the same things they deserve. So Catherine stays at Thrushcross Grange for several weeks while her ankle heals and becomes very good friends with Edgar and Isabella. And when she comes back to Wuthering Heights, she is all dressed up, she's cleaned up, she doesn't have more dirt all over her face, her hair is all done up nice, and she makes Heathcliff feel really self conscious in comparison to her being all cleaned up and fine and fancy. And he's still kind of in his rags, and he's too proud to feel ashamed, but also feels like, she's putting herself above him. He tries to clean himself up, and she laughs at him. Her new friends keep coming over, and she's spending time with them more than him. And she acts a lot different when she's around Isabella and Edgar. She acts more contained and proper and poised and gentle and submissive, whereas when she's out with Heathcliff, she acts wild and free and sometimes maybe a little bit bitchy. Meanwhile, her brother's wife gives birth to a son and dies, so Henley gets even more aggressive. He becomes a drunk. All the servants quit except for Nellie, who is the narrator, and Joseph, who is another like longtime servant of the family. There is a little bit of religious trauma, I think, woven into the story with the character of Joseph. He is very, very severe about his religious faith and often admonishing Catherine and Heathcliff for their wild, wicked ways and punishing them and forcing them to sit and read the Bible and stuff like that, which I think does kind of play into this theme of like competing wildness versus tameness in the two houses. Because on the one hand, we have Wuthering Heights, which is wild and grungy and wicked and untamed, and then we have Thrushcross Grange, which is fancy and pretty and proper and more contained and civilized. So the two houses are kind of put in juxtaposition in the same way that Edgar and Heathcliff are put in juxtaposition to each other. I also think it's kind of important to note that in the book, unlike I think pretty much every film version I've seen, Catherine and Heathcliff are teenagers at this part of the story. She's 15 and he's like 16 or 17. And I think that kind of puts into perspective their like wild, big emotions and the fact that they're not communicating well with each other. But unfortunately, during that time period, people did get married when they were teenagers, so their big wild emotions would and immaturity would affect their entire lives sometimes. So Edgar Linton proposes to Catherine and she accepts. And then Heathcliff overhears her telling the servant Nellie this. And she says that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff. And so he runs off and doesn't hear her say that she loves Edgar because he's nice and pleasant and handsome and rich, but she loves Heathcliff as if he were herself, and that they have that wildness in common that is just a part of who they are, and they are each other. And when Nellie, the servant, says that, like she'll have to be separated from Heathcliff if she marries Edgar Linton, she is completely shocked by this. Like, I guess she's a wide shoes girl because she's just like, no, of course not. I'm always going to be with Heathcliff. Like, he's always going to be around. That's not a question. And so she is depressed when she finds out that Heathcliff is gone for a very long time, but eventually she adjusts and marries Edgar Linton and has kind of a relatively content life until he shows up again. And as soon as Heathcliff shows up again, years later, he has money now. No one knows where he got it from. He owns Wuthering Heights. He won it in gambling with Catherine's brother. And Catherine makes no secret of how excited she is to see him and invites him in, and he's over all the time. And Edgar is jealous but doesn't know what to do. But then his sister gets a crush on him as well. And Catherine and her are fighting over him and kind of being real catty at each other. And Heathcliff hears about it. He doesn't like Isabella at all, but he is happy to marry her for her money. So he is kind of softly pursuing her. And Catherine sees him and Isabella in the garden together, and they end up having a big giant fight. And Edgar Linton hears them fighting and comes in and hears that Heathcliff has been after his sister. They almost get in a big fist fight, and Heathcliff leaves. And then Catherine and Edgar are fighting because Catherine's mad that Edgar told Heathcliff he wasn't allowed to come over anymore. She goes off into her room and is being very melodramatic and being like, oh, I'm gonna die if I don't get my way. I'm so sick. But that night, Heathcliff takes off with Isabella and they get married. And she realizes immediately her mistake once she gets to Wuthering Heights. And Heathcliff is not nice to her. He doesn't even give her a bedroom. He just kind of like says, yeah, fend for yourself. I guess you live here now, because he only married her for her money and to make Edgar and Catherine upset, which works. Catherine is shut up in her room for a little while until they realize that not only is she pregnant, but she is also very, very ill and might not survive. When Heathcliff hears about that, he sneaks in to see her, and they have this big confrontation, which they're confessing love and yelling at each other at the same time, and it's very Toxic Notebook-esque. They're talking about like, you left me while you married someone else, and like he grabs her hand so tight that it leaves bruises, but she is holding on to him by the hair and won't let him leave. And then eventually she faints and gives birth to a daughter. She dies. She doesn't ever wake up from that faint. And after she's buried, Heathcliff goes out to her grave and tries to dig it up. He's starting to dig up the grave until he sees her ghost. Eventually, Isabella leaves and she moves to London by herself and gives birth to a son. And then we have a time jump. This is where most of the movies stop. They mostly stop with Heathcliff and Catherine's story. And I've been saying Catherine, even though sometimes she's called Kathy, sometimes she's called Catherine, to kind of distinguish between her and her daughter. So I'm going to call her daughter Kathy and her Catherine, just to make it a little easier to tell the story. So then we get into the second half of the book, where Kathy is older and her cousin is going to come live with her because her aunt died. And she doesn't know she has neighbors, let alone that her neighbor and her father have this sordid past. And so she's out in the moors exploring one day, and meets Hareton, who she thinks is pretty nice. Hareton is Hindley's son, so that's Catherine's brother's son, who is her cousin. So she has two cousins, one on her father's side and one on her mother's side. She likes Hareton until she finds out that he's her cousin, and then she doesn't like that because, like Heathcliff, he hasn't been educated. He's really rustic, really rough, and she's just like, no, I'm not related to that. That's impossible. She lets slip that she has another cousin, and Heathcliff didn't know about Isabella's son, Linton. So when he finds out that she has another cousin who's coming to live with her, he says, no, that's my son. He's coming to live with me. Kathy is very bored. She's very bored. She lives in this isolated place out in the countryside and has no one to talk to. And now there is someone her age in the area. So she's willfully defies her father, who tells her not to go to Wuthering Heights to visit her cousin Linton, who keeps saying he loves her, but really his father is pushing him to pursue her so that there will be no dispute when Kathy's father dies about who Thrushcross Grange goes to. Kathy, who is bored and willful like her mother, just keeps going out and hanging out with Linton, even though he's not very affectionate and he's pretty like whiny and just complaining about how sick he is all the time. And eventually, her father is dying, and Heathcliff locks her into Wuthering Heights and says, you cannot leave until you marry my son, who is also dying. And so she does, and her father dies, and barely any time later, her new husband dies. And now she can't go home, and she's stuck at Wuthering Heights with her uncle slash father-in-law. It was normal at that time period in isolated places for cousins to get married. I know it's weird, it's icky, but at that point in time, it wasn't considered weird. So that's when Nellie finishes her story to Mr. Lockwood, and there's a little bit more where he goes back to the house and he sees Kathy kind of picking on Hareton for not being able to read, and then he tries to learn to read, and she picks on him for that because he's not very good at it. But then a year later, Mr. Lockwood comes again to Wuthering Heights and he sees Kathy and Hareton reading together outside, and then they all go off exploring on the moors and they're like giving each other kisses and stuff, and he's just like, what happened there? So apparently at one point in time, Hareton hurt himself, and Kathy was really upset and apologized for picking on him and teasing him for not being like cultured enough. And then he reluctantly forgave her, and then she started to teach him to read, and they started falling in love from there. And when Heathcliff saw this, he he's been so bent on getting revenge for how everyone treated him, but he really relates to Hareton, and he kind of like he sees himself as a father to Hareton, even though like he also is glad that he stole Wuthering Heights from him because like it's like revenge to his actual father. He sees a lot of himself in him, and as far as he was not educated, he was treated like a servant all his life, and then he sees him with Cassie and it reminds him of being with his Catherine and them wandering around the moors, and he just gets like this like quietness to him and stops being as like cruel and volatile and drunk and stuff all the time. They describe it as he just gets like this strange illness and stops eating and kind of just stares there, and they even speculate like, oh, could he have been like, I don't know, vampire or something? Who even is he? We don't know who he is, but he seems like creepy and spectral, like just sitting there, and he keeps looking into space and talking to space and what we assume is Catherine's ghost until he withers away and dies. Hareton and Kathy lock up Wuthering Heights and move to Thrushcross Grange because Mr. Lockwood no longer wants to live there. And that is the story of Wuthering Heights. I'd say it's not a romance. The romance between Kathy and Hareton is kind of sweet, and I think like there's like a generational healing element to that, which is kind of sweet. When we pretend that it's okay that they're cousins, because like back then people didn't see that as a problem. But like Cathy and Heathcliff's obsession with each other is, I understand why it's seductive, because it's like they're so passionate about each other. I was listening to a podcast earlier this week about Emily Brontë, and they were saying that her and her sisters read a lot of Lord Byron, and not only Lord Byron's poetry, but like the exploits of his life, which were pretty tawdry, shall we say. And so it seems very likely that part of the inspiration for Heathcliff was from Lord Byron, which makes sense because he has a lot of elements of the Byronic hero, right? Where he's this brooding, more of an anti-hero than a hero with a dark past, and he's just so misunderstood and no one knows. In general, the book really does like recall the romantic era in which Lord Byron was writing, where it was really all about these big heightened emotions and like what to do with that. And I really think there's a lot of themes tangled up, a lot of themes about class. And, we have the wild, grungy Wuthering Heights in juxtaposition to the tame, fancy Thrushcross Grange. And both Cathys choose between, well, I guess the second Cathy does do the why choose thing, just one of them dies. But they choose between, the ruffian and the like civilized gentleman. So there's a lot of like class divide there as far as themes go, and the wildness of the moor. But there's also like just this heightened emotions and people just acting on them, and what that actually looks like and what actually comes of that. Because for Cathy and the first Cathy and Heathcliff, it did not work out well. It ended in a lot of people dying and a lot of misery. And it's not like Romeo and Juliet, where the tragedy is that other sources were keeping them apart and they ended up dying. They did this to themselves. They were not communicating. They were making choices based on what felt good. Heathcliff wanted revenge. Cathy wanted to have it all. She didn't want to have to make a choice. And they caused a lot of destruction along the way. I've often referred to the Romantic period as sex, drugs, and poetry, because there's a lot of parallels to some of the Romantic poets, and like, I don't know what they call the 27 Club, right? Where there's this talent and this emotion and this like charisma, and then it just goes wrong and they end up being self-destructive. And that's very much what Heathcliff and Cathy do. But like there is something enticing about it at the same time, because society is so straight-laced. Society is more like Thrushcross Grange in a lot of ways, where there's a lot of pretense and stuff that people use to try and like create a structure to survive in. And sometimes the emotions and feelings are pushed down to try to create that sense of order. And so there is something enticing about seeing what would happen if you just had this unbridled passion where there was no guilt and nothing holding you back. And I think that really goes back to like the wildness of the moor as like a metaphor for these these feelings and things that a lot of times society has us keep down. And of course, in real life, you want to find that balance, right? You need a little bit of structure and like a sense of like caring about other people's feelings. But at the same time, you don't want to push down all that wildness, because if you push it down when it comes out, it's going to be destructive if you don't know what it is and know what it looks like. And I think for me, that's why I've been drawn to this book. That's why I've um, read it 4 times now. In college, I wanted to write a musical adaptation. I still kind of do. I just have so many other projects. I don't know if I'll ever get to it. But like, there's something enticing about pulling out all these emotions and looking at them. What do these emotions look like? These things that we are told to ignore and not think about. And it's like, it's dark. Heathcliff's out there digging up graves. When they're burying Edgar Linton, he does go to the grave, and he asks the gravedigger to open the coffin, and at this point it's 18 years later, and he's like just sitting there like, I want to see her, I want to see her. That is an unhealthy amount of obsession. 18 years later, he's still like digging up, literally digging up her grave and not letting go. And her ghost is everywhere. And it's not only destroying his life, but it's destroying everyone around him's life. On that same podcast I was listening to, they were also saying how Emily Brontë doesn't tell us what to think about this story. She just writes it. Here's these crazy people, they're doing these crazy things, drop mic. And especially for the time, most books were seen as supposed to be moral. That's why people complained about it, even though a lot of people were reading it and enjoying it at the same time, because it doesn't say condemn Heathcliff. It doesn't say condemn Kathy. It just says, here's people, they're doing crazy things, and just leaves it there. And I think that's also why a lot of people still kind of see it as a romance and still sort of want it to feel more like this great love story. And also maybe why the book is so good and so fascinating, because some books you just read straight through for the experience, but this is a book that every time I've reread it, I've read it with a purpose to study it for some at in some way. And there's just so much to explore in it, because Emily didn't give us a little bow of telling us what to think about it. She just gave us these characters and had them be doing these crazy things and let us draw our own conclusions. And so it's almost like a puzzle every time I read it. Like, what does it all mean? Like, what even is this? But yeah, she doesn't give us a clear moral at the end. Now we can conclude. She just gives it to us and lets us decipher it ourselves and see what we can make of that tangled mess. And I think that's why the story still haunts us. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing to Ink Spills if you enjoy fairy tales, Gothic literature, poetry, book recommendations, or writing.